Hello and welcome to Alaska Weather. I'm meteorologist Amanda Bowen. I'm so happy you could join us today. As always, we've got our contact information down there at the bottom of the screen, that phone number that you can call 24 hours a day to get a recording of the weather in your general area. If you have internet access, you can also visit us on the web at weather.gov/Alaska. And then also, if you have any comments or feedback for us, feel free to email us at nws.ar.tvweather@noaa.gov. Taking a look at our hazardous weather that we're expecting in the next couple of days, we do have a couple of wind advisories and a high wind warning in effect. Those are all going to be in effect for the Alaska Range and Delta Junction area from Wednesday afternoon through 1 a.m. on Thursday. So we have the high wind warning in effect for the eastern Alaska Range. That is going to be for wind gusts up to 70 miles per hour, which is going to make travel difficult, especially for high-profile vehicles, but also the potential for some blowing snow in the area. So even if there's not necessarily new snow falling at the time, any snow on the ground may be light enough that the winds could pick it up, blow it around, and make that visibility more difficult for travel in the eastern Alaska Range. Wind advisories for the Denali area as well as the Delta Junction and Tanana Flats areas, looking at wind gusts up to 55 to 60 miles per hour. So still a concern there with that wind advisory, still mostly a travel difficulty and mostly for high-profile vehicles. Again, wind gusts up to 55 to 60 miles per hour. Wednesday afternoon into Wednesday night for Delta Junction and Denali areas, with gusts up to 70 miles an hour for the eastern Alaska Range for that same period of time. As we look at our satellite imagery, it looks like the satellite was having a couple of issues this morning, which can happen this time of year. But as we look at our loop, we're seeing clouds coming up into the Gulf associated with our next low pressure system coming into the southern portion of the state. We can also see some clouds over the interior this afternoon. But what we don't see is a whole lot of activity in the Bering. It's actually a little bit calmer than it has been the last couple of weeks in the Bering right now. So if we take a look at our surface chart for today, we see our strongest low pressure system in the southern Gulf moving north towards the northern Gulf through the day today. We also have weaker low pressure systems right off the west coast as well as just south of the eastern Aleutians. That's going to mean that we have snow across portions of the west coast. That's going to be basically a chance of snow across that area, and some mixed rain and snow showers for southwest. We also have rain across the Gulf and some rain and snow for the Panhandle for today. As we head into tonight, we see that low pressure system moving north into the northern Gulf, bringing an occluded front, and that is going to increase that precipitation, particularly in the very northern Panhandle around the Yakutat area, where we're looking at the potential for some heavy rain tonight as that front comes through. Elsewhere, we're looking at snow for the southern half of the mainland as well as for portions of the far west coast, including the western half of the Seward Peninsula and up into the Chukchi Sea coast. For Wednesday, that low continues to weaken but remains in the general area of south central. So we're still looking at precipitation all the way from about Bristol Bay over through most of the Panhandle and northward, reaching all the way up to the Kaktovik area for the North Slope, some snow up there. Behind it in the Bering Sea, we do have a warm front that's going to be bringing some precipitation to the area as well as the chance for some breezy conditions, but certainly nothing out of the ordinary for this time of year there. And finally, for Thursday, we see another low pressure system, although very weak at 1,014 millibars, but nonetheless coming up into the Gulf behind that last low, bringing a trough into the area. It's just enough to spark some rain and snow, probably on the light side for South Central, Prince William Sound, Kodiak Island areas. We're also looking at some additional snowfall from the Yukon River up through the Brooks Range and to the northeastern North Slope. Although we do have high pressure over the western half of the state, with a 1,030 millibar high centered just north of the state and a strong 1,041 millibar high pressure system centered south of the western Aleutians, with that ridge of high pressure stretching basically between those two highs right across the west coast. Looking at our temperatures for Wednesday morning, I should mention we're doing something a little bit different today with our temperatures. We are going to go in order of time period, well, geographic area, I should say, instead of time period. So let us know via that email address if you have any comments or feedback about the change in the way that we're doing the temperatures. So we're starting out with the south and southeast look for Wednesday morning, looking like 30s for most of the area Wednesday morning. Cold spot there at Talkeetna, 30 degrees. A little bit warmer out on the Kenai Peninsula with 37 at Seward, and looking like 38 at Juneau for Wednesday morning. Wednesday afternoon for that same area, we are seeing high temperatures ranging from the upper 30s with 39 at Valdez into the 40s with 43 there at Middleton Island, and even some 50s in the southern panhandle with Klawock there at 51 degrees for Wednesday afternoon. Thursday morning, again for the same area, south and southeastern portions of the state, we are looking at not a lot of change from what we are expecting on Wednesday morning, with still our coldest temperatures in Southwest. We've got 29 there at Dillingham and 32 for Thursday morning at Talkeetna. And then a little bit warmer for the Panhandle, 33 there at Juneau, 35 at Haines for Thursday morning. And Thursday afternoon, even warmer, especially for the Panhandle, with 57 there at Klawock. So some chance of 60 degrees maybe eking out in a couple of spots for the southern Panhandle Thursday afternoon. Otherwise, 40s across the board, 45 there at Homer and 42 at Lime Village for Thursday afternoon. Now, moving on to the north side of the state for Wednesday morning, we've got single digits for lows Wednesday morning across the north slope with 1 degree there at Kaktovik, 4 at Utqiagvik. A little bit warmer across the interior, 25 at Fairbanks and 26 at Nome. For Wednesday afternoon, double digits, but barely for some of the north slope, 11 degrees just there at Dead Horse for a high on Wednesday afternoon. But 50s even across portions of the interior, 52 there at Fairbanks, 51 at Delta Junction, and 50 there at Eagle for Wednesday afternoon. Thursday morning, we're seeing a cooling trend across the west coast and much of the north slope, with lows right around 0 degrees for much of the north slope and cooler for the west coast, 21 for a low at Nome. For Thursday morning, even a couple of degrees warmer on the other side for the interior, with 27 there at Fairbanks. And for Thursday afternoon for the north side of the state, we are looking at 50s again for portions of the interior, but mostly looking at 40s, with 45 there at Tanana, 33 at Nome, so another chilly day for the west coast, 27 for Savunga, and we're looking at some double digits again for the north slope, 10 there at Dead Horse being the coldest spot for Thursday afternoon. For the southwest portion of the state, for Wednesday morning low temperatures, we are looking at generally 20s for Southwest, 26 there at Bethel, and 30s mostly for the Aleutians, with exactly 30 degrees there at Adak in the forecast. Wednesday afternoon, 30s again for Southwest, and even a couple of 40s for the Aleutians, 40 there at Dillingham also, looking at 35 at Bethel and 31 at Macoriac for Wednesday afternoon. Thursday morning, not a whole lot of change from Wednesday morning once again, so we're looking at 20s to around 30 degrees for the southwestern mainland and 30s mostly for the Aleutians, although we do have, it looks like a low of 28 there, around 28 there in the southern panhandle. Southern peninsula, Alaska Peninsula, that should be. And for Thursday afternoon, still cool along the immediate west coast with 36 there at Bethel, 33 at Nome, but some 40s as we head into the interior, 46 for McGrath on Thursday afternoon.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
On to a look at your aviation forecast. For Wednesday morning, we have IFR through the northern Gulf up into Prince William Sound and also Kodiak Island and the eastern portion of the Alaska Peninsula. MVFR conditions over much of the Bering as well as the immediate west coast. For Wednesday afternoon, we have IFR conditions still in that northern Gulf area for the Gulf Coast, from the southern Kenai Peninsula across Prince William Sound down to Kodiak Island and across the northern Alaska Peninsula, even up into the western Alaska Range and stretching up through southwest, interior southwest that is, and up the Yukon River. For Thursday morning, no improvement in the northern Gulf, still IFR conditions there. In fact, we see some deterioration to IFR conditions across portions of the central interior, up the Yukon River, and across the northeastern Brooks Range. Also IFR conditions developing with our incoming system into the Aleutians, and some IFR conditions in the northern Panhandle for Thursday morning. Lots of clearing for Thursday afternoon though. Still some patchy IFR conditions for the northern Gulf, but improving to MVFR across much of the interior mainland as well as the Panhandle. Still IFR conditions for the western Aleutians though Thursday afternoon. For Wednesday at our passes at AKwx Pass, we're looking at VFR conditions in the morning, deteriorating to MVFR conditions in the afternoon. Adigan Pass, also VFR in the morning, deteriorating to MVFR in the afternoon. Lake Clark and Merrill passes, both looking like IFR conditions all day on Wednesday. And Rainy Pass, IFR conditions all day on Wednesday as well, but we will see some MVFR conditions just west of the pass along the west entrance at Rainy Pass on Wednesday. For Windy Pass on Wednesday, MVFR in the morning, deteriorating to IFR on Wednesday afternoon. Isabel Pass looking like MVFR through the day on Wednesday. Mentasta Pass starting the day MVFR and improving to VFR on Wednesday afternoon. Tanita Pass IFR on Wednesday morning, improving some to MVFR on Wednesday afternoon. Portage Pass looking like IFR all day, but that'll be another case where we see some MVFR conditions along the west entrance and the west side of Portage Pass on Wednesday. And Chilkoot and White Pass is both expected to be IFR on Wednesday. Our freezing levels, our surface freezing level through the Bering across the Alaska Peninsula and then into south central and across the Gulf Coast into the Panhandle. We see a couple of areas of warmer air, one coming into the western Aleutians, 2,000 to 4,000 feet there, and then another into the Panhandle, 2,000 feet, all the way to 8,000 feet for the southern Panhandle on Wednesday morning. For icing on Wednesday, a lot of isolated moderate icing over most of the state, but we do have an area of considerable moderate icing across the northern Panhandle from about Yakutat westward to the north side of Prince William Sound. Again, that's considerable moderate icing above about 5,000 feet. We're looking at that isolated moderate icing above 7,000 feet from the Alaska Peninsula up through the central interior. Isolated moderate above 5,000 feet for the west coast and north slope, and between 3,000 feet and 8,000 feet for the Aleutians. Our jet stream on Wednesday, the main jet is stretching over eastern Russia and down across the Bering into the Aleutians. That's 120 to 130 knots out of the north there. We also have a secondary jet out of the south to southwest coming up into the northern Panhandle, peaking about 110 knots there. At 9,000 feet, we have our strongest winds across the Kamchatka Peninsula of Russia, about 80 knots there out of the west. And then once we get down into the Aleutians, we're looking at 40 to 50 knots out of the north. Another area of stronger winds over the southeastern interior, about 70 knots peaking there out of the south. And at 3,000 feet, we again have our strongest winds over the western Aleutians, but peaking about 40 to about 45 knots, up to 50 knots out of the northwest in the western Bering. And then also a secondary peak of about 50 knots just east of Prince William Sound out of the south. And finally, for turbulence, a couple of areas of considerable moderate turbulence for Wednesday. We have an area below 6,000 feet for much of the Panhandle, stretching up just to the east side of Prince William Sound, and another area across the western Aleutians that's going to be considerable moderate turbulence there as well, below 3,000 feet. Stay tuned for more Alaska weather after this.
Good evening, and thanks for joining us for another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder, joined again by Eric Stevens of GINA, the Geographic Information Network of Alaska from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And Eric, thanks so much for joining us again tonight.
Happy to be here, Dave.
Thanks, Eric. And we've been talking about the complex gathering of information from satellites, looking down on the surface of the planet, and some of those orbits around the planet work for Alaska, and some of them don't. There's a lot of challenges with those. How can we get better imagery for the poles and specifically for Alaska?
Right. Well, today we're going to talk about a very interesting kind of satellite orbit that has potential to be real helpful for the high latitudes.
Okay.
Especially us here in Alaska. Canadians, Russians, Norwegians will all be interested in this. The satellites are not in orbit yet. Now the future is uncertain, but it's possible, and if this happens, it will be wonderful for Alaska. Okay. It's called the highly elliptical orbit.
Oh, that sounds
it's interesting. Yeah. And I think first, to help our discussion, we should get back to some of Kepler's laws and how do satellites work.
Sure.
Kepler's first law, an orbit of a planet around a sun or a weather satellite around the Earth is not necessarily a circle, it's an ellipse.
Okay.
And the highly elliptical orbit takes advantage of this aspect. We're going to put the Earth in one of the ellipse and then stretch one of the foci of the ellipse and then stretch that ellipse out real far to make it highly elliptical.
The foci is that bend part of the end of the ellipse. If you're going to stretch out a rubber band, that would be the center, kind of the stretchy part.
Yes.
Ends. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And then Kepler's second law says that the closer something is to the thing that it's orbiting, the faster it goes.
Okay.
We see this in the solar system, that Mercury flies around the sun real fast. Jupiter, much slower. Jupiter's further away, it's slower. Mercury's closer in, it's faster. This happens with weather satellites too. Even satellites like the International Space Station, it's pretty close to the Earth. It goes around the Earth in only 90 minutes.
Okay.
That thing is moving.
Fast.
It's only 250 miles away. So how can we take advantage of these two aspects of Kepler's laws of motion to get better weather surveillance of Alaska? And this highly elliptical orbit is going to be the approach. So we have with us today our friendly planet Earth and our simulated satellite, the lid off of this salt shaker
like
here.
Sputnik there. Yeah.
There it is. It's shiny, it's metal, it's space worthy. And what we want to be able to do is, could you have a satellite hover over the top of the world, up over Alaska? You can't really do that. Geostationary satellites have to be over the equator.
Okay.
So how could we almost solve this? And this is the tricky part. Maybe should we tilt the Earth over?
Focus on the pole. That's what we're trying to accomplish here, right?
So here we have the northern side of the planet, and we're going to trace out the orbit of a satellite with this salt shaker lid here. Now imagine a highly elliptical orbit. So let's put the Earth in one of the foci of the ellipse, and we'll have an imaginary foci out here. So the satellite will not go in a circle around the Earth, but will be in this long strung out ellipse. So the satellite will go...
Kind of like a racetrack.
Yes, there you go, like a racetrack. So it's an oval elliptical shape like that. And notice now that when the satellite's over here, we've got a nice view of the northern hemisphere around. There's Alaska, Russia, Canada, Greenland, all there. So that's the ellipse aspect of an orbit, Kepler's first law. The second law saying that when you're further away as a satellite, you go slower. And this we can take real advantage of. Because the way this orbit works, when the satellite goes over Antarctica here, it's going to be close to the Earth. It's going to be moving, whoosh, goes on by. And then as it comes out here, it will slow down. This increases what is known as the dwell time. The satellite will just hang here looking for hours at Alaska and the high Arctic. And then eventually it will come around and it will accelerate and whiz around the South Pole and then come back and hang here for a while because it's further away from the planet. It goes slower. It has to. That's the laws of motion. And such like that, repeating.
Wow.
Now the real important way to make this work is you have to have two satellites. So that while one is whipping around the pole, you've got the other one out here, and they work as a team. You could then get a series of images of Alaska that can be almost from a constant frame of reference, and you can loop them together to make movies. You can take a picture every 10 minutes, say, of Alaska, and then loop it, playing it at several frames a second. You could see the clouds whiz on by. You know, the Weather Channel, weather broadcasters in the lower 48 especially can show these movie loops from the geostationary satellites. In Alaska, we've never really been able to do that very well, especially in the higher, most northern parts of the state, because those geostationary satellites are over the equator. It's not a good view. And this highly elliptical orbit whipping around the South Pole and then dwelling up here would be a way for us to get that constant frame of reference and do really good weather surveillance over the Arctic, seeing where those storms are, where they're going. Nothing quite like a movie loop of the weather in time to really illustrate what's important, what's going on.
And compared to what we have right now, we just have small windows or snapshots of what's going on with the polar orbiters. We don't have that long range view that's looking top down to give us that complete motion picture that helps us understand so much of the atmosphere at this
There's
point.
so many different kinds of satellites. Each has their advantage. Each is important, and the highly elliptical orbit satellite will also fit into that scheme. It's a nifty idea to solve an Alaskan challenge.
That's fantastic. Well, that sounds really exciting. And again, kind of a satellite dream of the future to come. Okay, very good. Thanks for joining us today, Eric. We really appreciate the information. And if you'd like to learn more about what Eric does at GINA, at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, we invite you to visit the web address that you see on your screen there. For Alaska Weather Facts, I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back for a look at your marine forecast. Starting with the sea ice edge, we have some northerly winds that have been in place over the Bering Sea, so we're seeing some shifting south of that ice edge, not past where it got at its largest extent this season, but right back down to that point. Now, we could see it shift about 10 nautical miles further south in the next 24 hours. It's going to be through the day on Wednesday. But then as we look into later this week, it looks like we're going to see some southerly winds return. So we'll see that ice edge start to push back north later this week. For our winds and seas over southeast on Wednesday, we are looking at southerly winds 25 to 35 knots over the Gulf and 10 to 20 knots over the inside waterways, although we do have gusts to 35 knots for the central and northern inside waterways on Wednesday. For Thursday, for the inside waterways, switching to northerly flow around 10 knots and some more easterly flow across the Gulf, 10 to 15 knots there. Seas in the 7 to 8 foot range for the Gulf on Thursday. For South Central on Wednesday, we have some southerly flow across the Gulf itself, 30 to 35 knots, with northerly flow through Cook Inlet. Some strong winds there, 35 knots all the way through Cook Inlet, as well as 10 to 15 foot seas for Cook Inlet and 11 to 17 foot seas for the Gulf on Wednesday. For Thursday, those winds and seas both coming down quite a bit. So some easterly flow through the Gulf, 15 to 20 knot winds and 7 to 8 foot seas, and just 10 knots of wind generally out of the north through Cook Inlet, just 2 to 3 foot seas, as well as 2 feet in Prince William Sound for Thursday. For the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island areas on Wednesday, we have northwesterly and westerly flow, 20 to 30 knots. Seas on the north side of the peninsula, 4 to 6 feet and 8 to 9 feet on the south side for Wednesday. And for Thursday in the same area, we're looking at more northerly flow, 15 to 25 knots out of the north, with seas in the 7 to 8 foot range. The Aleutians on Wednesday are looking like we're having some northwest flow for the central and eastern Aleutians, southwest flow for the western Aleutians, but 25 to 30 knots pretty much across the board. Also pretty consistent with seas in the 7 to 9 foot range. And going into Thursday, winds more out of the north, 20 to 30 knots, although we do have some southerly winds at 25 knots between Shemya and Kiska on Thursday. For the west coast on Wednesday, we've got 10 to 20 knots of wind across the ice, generally out of the north and west, and some stronger northwest flow out of the, 25 knots just outside of the ice in the open Bering. Seas 6 to 8 feet in that area with those slightly stronger winds. And then Thursday, winds increasing just a little bit across the ice out of the northwest, 15 to 25 knots, decreasing just a little bit over the ice-free Bering to about 20 knots at 6 feet seas. And finally, for the Arctic coast, for the North Slope, we've got east flow, 15 to 20 knots on Wednesday, and some northeast flow across the Chukchi, about 15 knots. Heading into Thursday, those winds coming down a bit, also shifting a little bit more northerly, 10 to 15 knots for the North Slope, and some easterly or northeasterly flow for the Chukchi at about 10 knots. Recapping what we're expecting for tonight, we have low pressure coming up into the northern Gulf. That's going to be bringing the potential for some heavy rain to the Yakutat area and some snow across the southern portion of the mainland, as well as another weak low pressure system along the west coast, bringing some snow to the immediate west coast itself. And into Wednesday, we have wind advisories and a high wind warning in effect for the Alaska Range as well as Delta Junction areas. For Delta Junction and Denali, that's going to be wind gusts up to about 60 miles an hour and gusts up to 70 miles an hour for the eastern Alaska Range Wednesday all the way through 1 a.m. on Thursday. Outside of that area, we'll see some continued chances for precipitation all the way from the eastern North Slope down through south central in the Panhandle as well as the Alaska Peninsula. And finally, on Thursday, things start to dry out a little bit. We've got dry for the west coast as well as dry weather for the Panhandle, with still some chances for precipitation across the central mainland. Thanks so much for watching Alaska TV Weather.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.